passenger in seat 23F. The flight that never lands. I've been a flight attendant for 17 years. I've worked short domestic hops and long international flights. I've dealt with drunk passengers, medical emergencies, extreme turbulence, and even one terrifying depressurization incident over the Pacific. But nothing, absolutely nothing compares to what happened on Flight 2377 from Chicago to San Francisco last winter. It was supposed to be a routine evening flight. Abongi 737, not even full. Departing O'Hare at 7:15 p.m. and arriving at SFO around 10 p.m. local time. The weather forecast was clear across our route, and most of the passengers were either business travelers or people heading home after the holidays. Nothing unusual. We were about an hour into the flight when I first noticed something odd about the passenger in seat 23F. I was doing a routine cabin check, making sure everyone was comfortable. When I glanced down his row, he was a middle-aged man in a dark suit. Nothing remarkable about his appearance. But while everyone else had their reading lights on, or were watching movies on the seatback screens, or sleeping, this man was just sitting, perfectly upright, hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead. Of course, that's not strange in itself. Some people just don't like to read or watch movies during flights. Some people prefer to think or meditate or just zone out, but something about his stillness caught my attention. As I passed his row, I asked if he would like anything to drink. He didn't respond or even acknowledge that I'd spoken. I leaned closer, thinking maybe he was wearing earbuds I couldn't see. "Sir, would you like something to drink?" He turned to me then, very slowly, and I got my first good look at his face. He was pale and naturally saw with dark circles under his eyes, but it was his expression that disturbed me the most. It was completely blank, devoid of any emotion or recognition. "No," he said after an uncomfortable pause. His voice was flat, almost mechanical. Then he turned back to stare straight ahead again. Slightly unsettled, I continued down the aisle. When I reached the galley at the back, my colleague Jessica noticed my expression. "Everything okay?" she asked. I shrugged it off. "Just a weird passenger in 23F. Probably just tired." Jessica frowned. 23F. Let me see. She checked her tablet with the passenger manifest. "That's odd. 23F should be empty on this flight." A chill ran through me. "Are you sure? There's definitely someone sitting there." She showed me the screen. Seat 23F was indeed marked as unoccupied. "Maybe it's a system error," I suggested. "Or maybe he switched seats after boarding." Jessica nodded, though she looked unconvinced. "I'll check with the gate agent's final boarding report when we land. Probably just a mix-up." We continued with the beverage service, and I tried to put the strange passenger out of my mind. About 30 minutes later, we hit some unexpected turbulence. The captain turned on the seatbelt sign, and I made my way through the cabin to ensure everyone was secure. When I reached row 23, I froze. The man in 23F was still sitting perfectly upright, hands folded in his lap, but now his head was turned all the way to the side, his neck at an impossible angle as he stared directly at me, and he was smiling. Not a normal smile, but a wide, rigid grin that showed too many teeth. I felt my heart race as I quickly looked away and continued my check. When I glanced back a moment later, he was facing forward again, expression neutral, as if nothing had happened. I hurried back to the galley and told Jessica what I'd seen. She agreed to go take a look herself, while I collected myself. A few minutes later, she returned, looking confused. "The seat's empty," she said. "What? That's impossible. He was just there." "Well, he's not there now. Are you feeling okay? You look pale." I insisted on checking myself. Jessica followed me as I walked back through the cabin. When we reached row 23, I was shocked to see that she was right. Seat 23F was empty. "I don't understand," I whispered. "He was just here." A man in a dark suit. Jessica put her hand on my arm. "Maybe you should sit down for a bit. I can handle things for a while." I agreed, feeling suddenly lightheaded. I sat in the jump seat at the back of the plane, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I imagined the man? Was I more tired than I realized? About 20 minutes later, the turbulence worsened. The plane was shaking violently, drinks spilling overhead, bins rattling. The captain made an announcement for everyone to return to their seats immediately and for the flight attendants to prepare for landing. Landing? We were only halfway to San Francisco. The intercom in the galley rang, and Jessica answered it. I watched her face grow increasingly concerned as she listened to the captain. When she hung up, she looked scared. "What's wrong?" I asked. "They've lost communications with air traffic control," she said quietly, "so passengers couldn't hear. Some kind of electrical problem. They're going to try to make an emergency landing in Denver." We went through the emergency procedures, securing the cabin and preparing the passengers. Everyone was frightened but cooperative. As I was checking seatbelts in the front section, I happened to glance back toward the rear of the plane. Clearly visible in seat 23F was the man in the dark suit. He was staring directly at me, that same unnatural grin on his face. I forced myself to look away and continue my duties. When I reached row 23, my heart pounding, I steeled myself to confront whatever was happening. But the seat was empty again. "Ma'am," said the woman in 23D, noticing my distress, "are you looking for someone?" "The man who was sitting here," I said, pointing to 23F. "Did you see where he went?" She looked confused. "No one's been sitting there the whole flight." I nodded and moved on, increasingly disturbed. The plane began its descent, the shaking growing worse. The lights flickered several times, and the captain made another announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some electrical issues that may affect the cabin lighting. Please remain calm and stay in your seats." Just then, all the lights went out completely, plunging the cabin into darkness, except for the faint emergency floor lighting. Passengers gasped and a few screamed. In those few seconds of darkness, I felt someone brush past me in the aisle, which should have been impossible, as everyone was supposed to be seated. When the lights came back on a moment later, I was standing next to row 23. And there he was again, in seat 23F, looking straight ahead. But this time, I noticed something else. Outside his window, which should have shown clouds as we descended, there was only darkness. Not night sky, not clouds, just pure, impenetrable blackness. I hurried back to Jessica and pulled her to the side. "The man is back in 23F, I whispered. "And there's something wrong with the view outside his window." Jessica looked concerned. "Rachel, there's no one in 23F. I just checked that whole section. Look for yourself," I insisted. She sighed but humored me, glancing over at row 23. Her expression changed immediately. "Oh my God," she whispered. "I see him now. And the window." She nodded, her face pale. "What is that? Where are the clouds?" Just then, the intercom chimed. Jessica answered it, listened for a moment, then slowly hung up, her hand trembling. "What is it?" I asked. "Cut," the captain says. "He says we're not showing up on radar anymore. Denver has no record of our flight." A cold fear settled in my stomach. What does that mean? Before she could answer, the lights flickered again. In that brief moment of darkness, I heard whispering all around us, countless voices, too quiet to make out the words, but somehow menacing. When the lights came back on, I immediately looked at seat 23F. The man was still there, but now he was looking directly at us. And this time, Several passengers were also staring at him, their expressions horrified. They could see him too. The plane began to shake more violently. Outside, through every window except the one by 23F, I could see we were descending through clouds. But through his window, there was still only blackness. The captain's voice came over the PA system again, but this time it sounded different, strained, frightened. Flight attendants, prepare for immediate landing. Jessica and I rushed to our jump seats and strapped in. The plane was descending rapidly now, the pressure changing in our ears. Passengers were crying, praying, holding on to each other. I couldn't help myself. I had to look at 23F one more time. The man was now standing up, despite the violent turbulence, despite the seatbelt sign, despite the fact that everyone else was desperately clinging to their seats. He was standing perfectly still in the aisle, unaffected by the plane's movements, staring directly at me. And then he smiled again, that horrible, too wide smile. He raised his hand and pointed at me, then at his watch, as if to say, "It's time." The plane lurched sickeningly, and I closed my eyes, certain we were about to crash. The screaming of the passengers, the roaring of the engines, the violent shaking, it all reached a crescendo. And then, silence. Complete and utter silence. I opened my eyes slowly, expecting to see destruction, expecting pain. But everything looked normal. The plane was stable. The lights were on. Passengers looked confused but unharmed, glancing around at each other with bewildered expressions. Jessica grabbed my arm. What just happened? Before I could answer, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Calm and professional once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the turbulence. We should be landing in San Francisco in approximately 1 hour. Flight attendants, you may resume service. San Francisco, but we were supposed to be making an emergency landing in Denver." I checked my watch. It read 8:30 p.m., exactly the time it had been when we first hit turbulence. That was impossible. We'd been in crisis mode for at least 30 minutes. Jessica and I shared a look of utter confusion. Had we both experienced the same hallucination? Had the entire plane? I unbuckled my seatbelt and stood on shaky legs. I had to check seat 23F. It was empty. Not just unoccupied. The seat looked like it had never been set in. No indentation in the cushion, no sign anyone had been there. The rest of the flight proceeded normally. We landed in San Francisco right on schedule. As passengers deplaned, they chatted and gathered their belongings as if nothing unusual had happened. No one mentioned the turbulence, the darkness, the man in 23F. It was as if none of it had occurred. Except Jessica and I remembered, saw. We stayed behind after everyone had deplaned, trying to make sense of what we'd experienced. Maybe we were both overtired, Jessica suggested, not sounding convinced. Both of us, having exactly the same hallucination. I shook my head. As we were gathering our things to leave, one of the pilots emerged from the cockpit. He looked exhausted, with dark shadows under his eyes. "Tough flight?" I asked cautiously. He looked at me strangely. You could say that. He hesitated, then added in a low voice, "Did you notice anything unusual during the flight?" Jessica and I exchanged glances. "Like what?" I asked. "Like," he lowered his voice further, "like we were somewhere else for a while. Somewhere we shouldn't have been." A chill ran through me. "The passenger in 23F, I whispered. The pilot's face drained of color. "You saw him too, the man in the dark suit." We all stood there in silence, the empty plane suddenly feeling very cold. 2 days later, I was scheduled to work a return flight from San Francisco to Chicago on the same aircraft. I nearly called in sick, but curiosity got the better of me. I had to know if it had been the plane, or the route, or just some shared delusion. As we were preparing for boarding, I checked the passenger manifest. My heart nearly stopped when I saw it. Seat 23F was assigned to a J. Smith. I immediately went to the gate agent. The passenger assigned 223F. What's their full name? She gave me an odd look but checked her system. It just says John Smith. Looks like it was a last-minute booking. John Smith, the most generic name possible, practically a placeholder. When boarding began, I positioned myself where I could watch for the passenger assigned to 23F. But no one stopped at that row. Once everyone was seated, I walked through the cabin to check seat. 23F was empty. Relief washed over me, followed immediately by unease. I approached the gate agent again. The passenger 423F, did they board? She checked her tablet. Yes, it shows they boarded, but the seat was empty. I felt a familiar chill run down my spine. As we prepared for takeoff, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. So I kept glancing back at row 23, at the empty seat by the window. The flight took off normally. Clear skies were forecast all the way to Chicago. About an hour into the flight, I was serving drinks when I felt it's the same odd stillness in the air that I had experienced on the previous flight. I looked back toward row 23. There he was, the same man, in the same dark suit, sitting perfectly upright with his hands folded in his lap. And outside his window, where there should have been clouds and sky, there was only darkness. He turned to look at me, his face breaking into that horrible grin. He raised his hand and tapped his watch again. Over the intercom, the captain announced, "Flight attendants, prepare for landing." But we were nowhere near Chicago. We had only been in the air for an hour. As I strapped myself into my jump seat, a thought occurred to me, a horrible realization. What if we had never left that moment of turbulence on the previous flight? What if we were caught in some kind of loop, endlessly flying, endlessly experiencing the same terror? Through the windows, I could see we were descending through clouds. But I knew that if I looked at the window by seat 23F, I would see only blackness. I don't know where we're really going. I don't know if we'll ever truly land. I do know that the next time you board a plane and take your seat, you might want to check who or what is sitting in 23F. And if you see a man in a dark suit, sitting perfectly still with his hands folded in his lap, my advice is simple. Get off the plane. Get off immediately. Because some flights are never meant to land.